Okay, welcome back. Our last roundtable today, after which I'll say some things to close up and release us all back into the wild for whatever adventures may come your way. I don't know. I need a clone. We decided to put this together, not just because of USP, but also because of what USP represents and what it is starting to mean to the industry in terms of the remote gateway and other consumer networking devices. There has been so much work in this area over the last several years that we haven't really sat down and talked about it as a group, right? And we were going to have Jose from RDK, but he couldn't make it. But I want to make sure that that voice is at least represented in some way, even if we can't say anything in an official capacity. So I would ask that if you do know things about RDK and some of the deployments, then feel free to speak up within the capacity that you're allowed to. We don't want to step on anybody's toes in that regard, but it's a very important part of the conversation. It was just an unfortunate set of circumstances that he can't be here. So, but I don't want to leave that out. So why don't we just go down the row, introduce yourselves really quickly, say who you work for, why it is that you're on the panel. I realize that, it's going to get a little weird, but that's all right.
I'm John Blackford. I work for Vantiva. I believe I'm on this panel because I'm the project lead for USP-Agent. So that is the open source USP-Agent that is part of the Open Broadband line, which is Open Broadband is basically Broadband Forum's open source arm, so to speak. And the OBUSPA project is a open source kind of reference implementation of the USP specification from the agent perspective.
Hi, Wojtek Makowski. I work for Orange. I'm VP CP ecosystem, and I represent Orange at the board of directors of the Purple Foundation. And this is the reason I'm here right now. So, as you know, the Purple Foundation works very closely with BBF. The big ambition of the Purple platform is to be fully standard compliant. And when I'm saying fully, it really means fully and not roughly. And this is also why we have this very close collaboration with BBF and why we are trying to standardize with BBF all new needs and improve the things that has already been defined sometimes before, etc. And that's it as introduction.
Hello, my name is Peter Steinhauser. Okay, no, this is not correct. Peter Steinhauser. We had it before. I'm working for embed. Embed is a software house specified in Open WRT and Linux kernel driver development. So we have roughly 15-20 years experience. We work very closely with the Open WRT core maintainers, and my role in the company is to bridge between the industry and the community and to figure out how we can bring common infrastructure into Open WRT so the wheel does not need to be reinvented too many times. And I have to add a disclaimer, which is very important. So I'm not speaking for Open WRT. I cannot speak before the community. Yeah. So I'm speaking on behalf of my company and its Open WRT experience. Besides that, I'm Purple's project manager in the Purple Foundation and worked very closely with those two gentlemen there. And we're trying to bring best open source software to the operator market.
All right. And again, I'll add the same comment that I had before. Feel free to jump in and ask questions at any time. Don't wait for me to give them the softballs. But the first softball, can we talk a little bit about why it is that we're even here talking about open source on the gateway in the first place in relation to standards, right? those worlds have been separate for kind of a long time, and I think in almost every industry, right? And for us, kind of recognizing why it's important and how it's got to the point that we decided to also include open source as part of the plan.
Yeah. So why standardization and open source are basically the same thing right now, at least according to myself. First of all, if you need to move fast, and we need to move fast, okay, the pace of making standards as it was a few years ago is not agile enough, so we need to move much faster. And when we move much faster, when we need to move much faster, you face two problems. One is maybe your specification, your standard specification will have some gaps, maybe will not be implementable or not in an efficient way, etc. So open source is a way to prove that it works, it makes sense, including from the implementation point of view. So that's really important. Another aspect is when we need to move fast, it means that the implementation must be available ready for deployments, for yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another reason. So the only way to have those two problems addressed is to have something that is open source and ready for deployments. This is how I see it. So the way we collaborate with BBF is, okay, there is a new need. We define how we see it. We start implementing it. At the same time, we're discussing with BBF. Those two things move in parallel. Then BBF defines the standard that may be a little bit different. So at Purple side, we'll upgrade it. But we know that when the standard is ready, the implementation is ready too. So that's at Purple side, but it's more than that. And I believe my colleagues will say more about it.
Yeah, I think that question really hits into one of my slides that I kind of started with yesterday in my presentation, where one of the industry trends we see is moving from proprietary to open standards stacks, specifically on the gateway. And the reasons behind that is with the proprietary stack, you're typically tied to potentially a single CP vendor. Every CP vendor has its own proprietary stack. Yes, that may be based on Unix of some flavor, but you don't really, as an operator, the operator doesn't really have much of a say in what functionality is in there without going through a lot of trouble to enhance that one vendor's stack. And then if they want to have a second vendor, well, they have to do all the same stuff again. And that's a lot of wasted development cycles going on when as Wojtek said, you want to go fast. So as you move into more of an open stack, you get the shared community all developing towards a single focused area. You get the opportunity for multiple operators to come in and kind of share in that as well to kind of help define the requirements and the path forward such that it's going to be a solution that everyone can actually build upon and go faster with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would like to address 2 points here. One is going exactly in Wojtek's direction. So standards should be implemented open, which brings me to this concept of common infrastructure. So what we see in the industry, or we have seen, and John already said it, the wheel was reinvented many times. Yeah. So there are certain fields where that does not make any sense. That's what we have standards for. So by focusing on open source implementations and building an active community, even competitors can join the community, can jointly work on the things they all need, and can focus on the fields they compete. That's where they can put their resources in. Yeah. So it's also an economic situation. It makes total sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about how it's different for sort of the consumer electronics world when it comes to routers versus the projects that are now being driven by operators? This is almost a Peter specific question, but it's like kind of a historical question, right? Because Open WRT has been around for a really long time, right? And it was used by nerds, right? Not just nerds, but people could install it on any gateway at any time if they wanted to, right? Versus now where we're kind of going this direction of the operators taking control of the situation, even if there are Open WRT things behind it, right? And trying to build a more carrier grade thing. That goes for RDK and for Purple, right?
You know, I remember many years ago, I spent an exciting time explaining to the Orange management why all those people saying that they are all standard compliant because they are Open WRT based are just saying, you know, stupid things. So there was a belief that, you know, just because you are based on Open WRT, that it grants that you have a common platform. Of course, that was not the case. It was a starting point, an excellent piece of software to start doing an actual carrier-grade software. But what was missing, it was quite substantial, okay? And everybody was doing it in parallel, the same effort, and at the end, no difference, okay? They were doing the standard stuff. Frankly speaking, I'm not aware of any successful business model right now in implementing the standard, okay? So they just make no sense. So Open WRT was a great thing, but it was not a sufficiently tuned for the needs of the operators.
Tuned is a good word, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's what we needed.
Yeah, absolutely right, Wojtek. And I mean, this is always, you have to consider the communities. So the Open WRT community is a community that is different from the operators. So it has different needs, different requirements. So it makes total sense for the operators to say, okay, we can leverage what we have there, where we can build on top. It makes sense for us. But of course, we have different needs. Yeah. So stock Open WRT, it does not bring the features an operator needs. Yeah. So it's just a matter of fact.
Right. Right. Yeah. John?
I think they nailed it.
Right. So let's talk about, you know, the role of that USB is playing in this situation, because it's kind of interestingly enough.
I have to say,
oh no,
first.
Yeah, go ahead.
And this is not a joke. This is not to make you pleasure. For Purple, USP is really a cornerstone for internal architecture. I said it in the previous roundtable, but this is really important, okay? The way we designed Purple was to say, okay, how we can be as close as possible to the standards, how we can leverage them, and, you know, to be to have something so much rooted in the standards that, you know, it's hard to imagine more. And because we believe that this is the only way to get agreement from everybody, just to avoid that people will complain about doing this or that in this way or another. So being based on standards also helps you to move faster because it avoids some unnecessary discussions. Okay, so this is why we said, okay, if you will look at what the different data models do, okay, basically they define abstractions of features. Okay, so why should we try to define another abstraction, okay, of the features for the CP? So that was the
try.
We could, but why? Then second one was, okay, we have something like USP, which is a protocol to deal with those abstractions. It was not optimized, you know, for an internal use, but we said, why not, given that the entire architecture of USP enabled different underlying protocols. So we had the discussions, we made some proposals, and this is how it happened. So today, as I said, you cannot use USP with a Purple gateway for the remote access, remote management, etc. But you will use USP anyway because this is how it runs internally. Okay?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of what led USP 1.3 and the direction that it went into introducing the Unix main socket MTP and the internal services architecture and stuff like that, is the ability to be all over inside, Purple OS, such that any application that gets deployed can now expose its own data model. It can be a part of the overall system from an external perspective, instead of just one-off applications that you have to manage in a proprietary manner. You can now manage all those applications via the same remote management channel that you have, because they expose their own data models. And that's all USP communications and messaging going out throughout the system in between the various different services. So it's key to that aspect.
Peter, do you have anything to add? I have a specific question about this for Open WRT as well, but if you have anything to say about what we just said, yeah. Oh, I've always been curious if Open WRT's had tier 69 support, right? Or in the past, right? Yeah. Oh.
I heard so many times I was asking, what are you talking about? Because if you are talking about the software stack that provides this protocol, I agree. But how about the data models that need to be behind?
Well, so my question is there any trickle back into the Open WRT project from all of the work that we're doing here?
I think from the Purple perspective, so far not. But we have to take into account that things were accelerated literally tremendously over the last 2 years to get things moving. Yeah. So this at the end, I mean, this needs some sacrifices and some focus on what you want to achieve. Yeah. So I think we are now evolving a stage in Purple where we can slow down a little bit, stabilize things, refine things, and then we can also discuss what could be brought back if possible, what would make sense.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, this is also, it's very important for operators, and Wojtek emphasized it many times. It's speed.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you need to bring your products to the market. That's why applications are so important for the industry. Because this means speed. Yeah. And also the container management unification in USP 103, it also offers interesting synergies crossing the different approaches. Let's say Purple OS and RDK theoretically could use the same containers, because I mean there are some operators who say, okay, for historical reasons we have to deploy RDK on some devices, but maybe we would also like to leverage Purple OS. And then if you can use the same technical approach, that would reduce your management efforts. Yeah. And in Purple, there is an initiative, the LCM initiative, which is exactly addressing this for RDK B as well.
Cool. John, I wanted to ask a little bit about just to talk about because it was beyond it was more than just the usual reasons that we're talking about now that we decided to do OBUSBA, right, in terms of standardization. Can we talk a little bit about the reason why we decided to do that out of the get-go versus TR69, obviously? But
well, I mean, if you look at the way TR69 happened, it's the specification was written and then it was out there, and then there was people that jumped on it very fast, because at the time there was not a very good way to actually do remote management devices in the home. You could try to do SNMP, but that wasn't very pretty. And so Broadband Forum as a whole didn't really have an open source arm at the time or anything like that. So it was up to the community as a whole to kind of produce any open source solutions and anything. And I think what we learned from a TR69 ACS vendor is that when those things were seeded to the public, they weren't the best quality and they were not maintained. And so one of the things, we encountered as an ACS vendor is that we had to manipulate our own code based on what open source solution was in the CPE.
Yeah.
So it was like, okay, well, it's not it's not actually adhering to the standard or the specification. And the operator goes, well, I don't care, make it work.
Yeah.
And so the ACSs had to consistently go and change their code to address CP in the market. And so with USP, and one of the reasons we wanted to get an open source solution out there kind of early is to make sure that we try to seed the industry with an open source solution that was going to be a little closer to the specification and maintained and kind of under the Broadband Forum umbrella. Now it's not so it is a reference implementation. There's definitely, there's no data model to it outside of the actual smallest amount of data model you need to run a USP-Agent.
Right.
But it's a starting point that CP vendors can build upon, or operators can grab to kind of do testing and stuff like that.
Right.
And that's kind of one of the main reasons. It's just to help out the industry as a whole, provide something that's going to be maintained, and it's got a level of quality that people can trust.
Right.
Which is also why we're working with CD Routing and QA Cafe to try to get some more compliance testing built into our CI/CD pipeline so that we can actually have a little bit of proof point.
Right. And actually, I'm glad you said that, not just because it's QA Cafe and CD Runner, but also because we went into it to be able to prove USP to ourselves, right? It's like the nice thing about having an open source project alongside of the standard that you're doing is that, if it fills that a little bit of that real world component, way before people start trying to implement it for real in their devices, and we've learned the lesson now. I always like to bring up, I don't have the slide right now, but I always like to bring up the triangle of successful technology, right? Where it's like you have the standard and the open source and the testing, right? And if you don't have one of those things, then
Well, and part of when we were writing USP as specification in Broadband Forum, we actually had one person that was very dedicated to trying out and trying to implement every single thing from an agent perspective. Tim Carey, who's moved on from the Broadband Forum to other activities in his career, but he was exceptional at basically trying out every single piece that we were trying to define in the spec just to make sure it would actually work.
right. Yeah. Yeah. It was nice. He was literally writing Python like while we were there. Yeah. So let's, I want to ask the question about, just to sort of have people hit home the point about what open source ends up looking like without standards, right? Because there were definitely solutions out there that, because Wojtek, you mentioned, people will come along and say, oh, I implemented the open source, therefore I'm standardized, right? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, the definition of open source can be a little bit tricky, because theoretically, if you create source code and you just publish it somewhere under a respective license, this is open source. But I have a slightly different understanding about it, because, I mean, this only makes sense if you have a living community. You have people who contribute to jointly work on it and also to fight for the best solution.
Mm-hmm.
This makes a good open source project so valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And this needs a lot of work. Yeah. And I think a good example for me is the OBUSPA, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would like to see a little bit more contributions on the code base. Yeah. But it's a good starting point, and because it's a really clean implementation of the standard. It is doing just that. Nothing else, nothing fancy. So you really know, okay, you know what you get. It's under active development. It's getting a lot of input. Yeah. If you look at the 1.3 specification, that is adopted, properly implemented. So I think it's a good example. It always has some room for improvement, but I mean, we're working on that, right?
Yeah. From my perspective, the fact that OBUSPA is linked to the Broadband Forum, it basically means that this is the only implementation about the USP-Agent that we should have. Okay. I don't see any reason why it should be somewhere else. No, really. I believe we shouldn't spend our time on trying to re-implement the same standard protocol. you can have a product leveraging this protocol that provides a lot of value. I agree on that, but not the protocol itself. Okay, it's just pointless. So as this stack is something that is associated for BBF, from my perspective, this is the only right one. Okay, so we had those discussions at some point in time at the Purple Foundation. We had some temporary solution, etc. But the decision was we will co-invest with, you know, CommScope and with BBF, and we will get this stack adapted into the needs of the Purple platform. Okay, because it comes from BBF, and I believe that this is the right way to move forward. We have discussions about Matter, for example. We shouldn't re-implement some Matter stuff if it's available in open source, okay? Open source that is associated to CSA. So this is the way we see, you know, how we should move forward.
Right.
We need to collaborate and to avoid having the same stuff done again and again and fragmenting the things, etc. That's, by the way, one of the other aspects. I hate fragmentation. So if somebody wants to fragment, he can go and do that. We will not forbid that. But we want to have something, you know, where we concentrate all our efforts, a kind of standard common stuff.
Right.
That's the way I see it.
John, do you have?
I guess just one thing to kind of follow on it, not necessarily directly answering your question, but following what Peter said about how an open source project is alive, kind of a community aspect, and it needs contributions to drive it forward. I think in looking at that, it's also very similar to an open source, open standards in industry, that without that input, that contribution to drive that standard forward, you don't really have the standard either. You really need to continually be looking at that standard and evolving it and making sure it's going to fit the industry and the needs.
Right. Can I ask a risky question and talk about the risks? Right. So like, you know, we've had a lot of conversations about open source eventually, you know, it in other areas in different industries, right? In order to ensure that it gets maintained and updated, usually some company comes along and takes ownership of it. And if they don't, then usually those things get worse over time, right? Can we talk a little bit about those risks? And, you know, obviously we have organizations that are maintaining these things, but I would want to allay people's fears, you know, especially operators, especially OEM vendors, about how we're trying to avoid those risks. And not just the risk of future maintenance, but also the risk of, you know, early decisions getting it too embedded in there that nobody's going to change and nobody's looking at them, that kind of a thing, you know.
Yeah, I mean, given the experience I have absolutely no concerns, because the most important thing is when a software is being used in real life, if it's really actively used, people are working on it, then somebody naturally is maintaining it. Yeah. So this is going to happen. The maintainer role sometimes is shifting a little bit. I mean, it's always also individuals who contribute, and sometimes the way in life changes. Somebody drops out of a project, somebody else steps in. I mean, if you look at Open WRT, it was never ever associated to any company, and it's there since 20 years.
Yeah.
And if you look at the core maintainers, there are a few people who are there since 20 years, but the rest of the team is constantly changing.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and I think this is a good sign for a healthy project. And if I look at this industry, at the open standards, at the huge interest in USP, in the tier 1 data model, which is providing so much value for each operator, I have no concerns, frankly speaking.
It was well said that, you know, once it's used, but really used, then the fears are much lower, but suddenly people know how to use it. So when they know how to use it, they are able to do something about what they are using, okay? And this is how the skills are spread over a large group of people, etc. So the initial fears are disappearing. Okay.
Mhm.
The problem, because I know why sometimes I'm hearing the same type of fears. The problem is that when you want to start something new, okay, and you believe that it will start because tens of different companies will come, each will bring something, at the end will have something wonderful.
Rainbows.
It doesn't fly. Okay. So it requires investment.
Mhm.
Somebody needs to be paid for doing this stuff, etc. So this is how it works at the beginning. Okay. The question is, what's your goal and how you will enforce that this goal will be fulfilled. Okay. And this is what important. And once you arrive into this stage where the stuff starts being used and anybody can use it, and to grab how it works, how I can do something about it, etc., the fear disappears. It doesn't mean that it will be fully automated or self-maintained. It will be to a large extent, but there must be a kind of minimal insurance that somebody maybe not fixes all the issues, but somebody that keeps care of how to make sure that those different inputs are not bringing too much entropy. At the end, you have such a crap that nobody can understand anything anymore. So you need some, role. And at the Purple Foundation, this is exactly what we are currently working on, is how to ensure not only the roadmap development that we are funding each year, but also how to provide this minimal set of maintenance, okay, to the community to make sure that if there are big problems, they can be fixed, and all the inputs that are coming fulfill some number of requirements that are compatible with the general vision and this kind of rules. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not too much more to add, but I do want to kind of channel Lincoln Lavoie, the Broadband Forum Tech Chair, who had to leave early this week, but
He's going to Bermuda.
yeah, now he's going to the Bahamas.
Oh, Bahamas, excuse me.
No, now we're getting into song territory. Bermuda. Oh, sorry. But one of the things Lincoln always said is that what he wants to see with the open source projects is upstreams. And that's definitely something that we've done with OBUSPA, with an upstream into Purple OS, and as well as there's one into RDKB. So I think we've hit the big two. Open WRT might be a third. So we're definitely trying to make that happen, because that's the upstreams is where you get that proof point of usability. People are using this.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Maybe also a quick note. We should be aware and accept that every open source community is different. Yeah. So there is no blueprint. There are some principles. Yeah. But so for instance, let's say the Open WRT community works completely different like the Purple community works. But there are simple reasons for that. And in Purple, the operators, they have a very clear targeted roadmap. They have a tight timeline. So this project needs a different organization and leadership than other projects. Yeah. So it's, yeah, so if people say, yeah, but it does, here it works like this and here like that, so this is not right. And I say, no. Every project needs to find its own way. And success at the end is proving that the way is working.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's entirely dependent on the goal of the project to begin with, right? Which may be a totally different use case. Yeah. Cool. Any questions from the audience while we have everybody here? Is everybody completely and totally familiar with Purple and OBUSPA and how it's all been working? And Craig?
I'm going to sound like a scratch record. So I talk to service providers large and small all over the world. And I'll talk to them about Purple iOS, and if it's a tier 2, 2, 3, they go, oh, that's the Orange thing, isn't it? Or the Verizon or the AT&T. If I talk RDK, that's the cable company's thing, isn't it? How do we make open standards and BBF and the work we're doing here, these open source projects, and then everything on the side, the application providers or whatever that's going to be using it, relevant to those tier 2s, tier 3s, because our networks are going to get consolidated. How do we make it relevant and educate those guys? So it's not just seen as the big guys with the deep pockets and the wide engineering resources that is writing all of this. Sorry, and I'm playing devil's advocate because I believe in it. You know,
A very good question. Okay, so from the, let's say, big operators that are behind Purple point of view, we strongly believe in one thing, that once it's deployed, there will be much less questions like that, okay? Because, you know, the number of times people ask it, how many deployments you have, it just makes me crazy. So this year, all 3 big operators will deploy Purple, so we'll stop talking about that. And then we'll be looking much more on what it is about, what value it brings to tier 2 or tier 3 operators, okay? And then they will discover that it fits their needs, you know, one-to-one. Because this is how it's designed. Of course, big operators like the 3 I mentioned have some crazy specific stuff. It's always like that. But what we are trying to achieve with Purple is that what is really specific is separated by a well-defined border. Okay, so those guys will not be polluted by this kind of things because, you know, what is specific to Orange, AT&T doesn't care, Verizon either, and so on. So we don't put this kind of things that are specific into Purple. So in Purple, it's really fully standard-based, and it enables you, if you want, to customize, but without polluting Purple platform. So those guys that if they don't want to add any crazy stuff, and usually they don't, they will not need to do that. But on the other hand, they will be able to get the devices that are already Purple ready, so a better time to market, and also to get benefit from the application ecosystem that will bring, okay? So I'm sure that it will be most probably even more interesting for tier 2 and tier 3 operators than for the big ones, because the big one will still have to do some amount of work to do the crazy stuff. But the smaller ones will take it as it is.
And I would also like to add, I mean, I'm a little bit of a software engineer as well. I'm not doing much coding, but what I've learned is the code I write today, I'm going to delete tomorrow. I'm going to rewrite it. So
Who wrote this?
oh my goodness, that's my nightmare question. And the worst question, actually, if you look at old code, is like, why the hell does it work? Yeah. But what I'm actually trying to say is also a project like Purple, yeah. So it's evolving, yeah. So the way the software is structured, let's say if tier 3, tier 2 operators come in and they say, yeah, we have some ideas, yeah, how we can make it more flexible and everybody's benefiting from. I mean, this is open, yeah, it's open for discussion, and the software is always evolving, it's alive, yeah. So it's changes, and I think we just should be positive about it, and we should, and also those operators, they should speak out. They should speak out what they need. Yeah, I mean, Purple is currently driven by the big 3, I call them, and of course, it's like focused on their needs. It's a natural thing. Yeah, so it's very normal. But if more parties engage, yeah, then it's also changing. That's at least what I think is going to happen.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. The more input we can have, the better. But I also agree with you that, you know, tier 2s and tier 3s are usually going to be pulling off the shelf products. Because, and the point that I think we need to remember as a Broadband Forum or a Purple Foundation is that tier twos and tier threes, they don't have a lot of extra resources to send to these kinds of events or to be active participants in Purple Foundation. They have people that work for them that wear about 15 different hats, and they just struggle to keep up with their day-to-day jobs. But what I do think we can do to help them out is, as we go closer to real-world deployments of Purple OS and USP-enabled Purple OS and USP-enabled RDK deliveries, if we can make sure that these off-the-shelf versions of these open source projects have USP-enabled, such that the CP vendors that are pulling them in and integrating them into the CP hardware and then offering that hardware up to the tier twos and tier threes, it's there, it's ready to go. And that's one of the reasons why, from a USP perspective and from my company's perspective, we've been trying to get OBUSPA upstream into Purple OS and RDK and stuff.
Right. Is there, so to throw one of the questions that Wojtek kind of threw at me before today, and a great way to wrap this up, what is the role that certification plays in that? Like, can that help that? If people are willing to do it, right?
Yeah, I mean, the certification gives the service provider, the operator, that warm and fuzzy feeling that what I'm getting is probably going to work, and that I don't have to put too much effort into, hopefully, when I go to deploy this and nothing works. So
we're going to change the QA Cafe checkmark to be wobbly.
So I mean, I think maybe it was you, Jason, that explained to me a long time ago the difference between interoperability and compliance. Compliance is that you've been tested against the actual specification. Interoperability is just that you're testing against the other side that you're talking to. You may both be doing the wrong thing according to the specification, but you can talk. So compliance gets you part way there. Mm-hmm. You're assuming that the other side is going to be compliant as well.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's an important step, and that's why we're working with QA Cafe with OBUSPA to try to get more of that compliance testing kind of done. It may be a report generated so that the users of the software can look at it. And I know Purple OS is doing a lot around compliance too. So
yeah, so that three main reasons why the Purple Foundation decided to have those three certification programs. First is, as John mentioned, it's about the compliance, whether the standards are properly implemented. The second is, it's always about the quality, whether this open source stuff has some minimal level of quality and what it really means. So that's also important for tier 2, tier 3 guys. And the third point, and maybe from some perspective, and the most important, is that, we work with those guys to have the tool that makes all those certification tests. All Purple certification tests will be available in this tool. You can run them as many times as you want, etc. We don't care. We care about one thing, that will not, so anybody can do that, but will not certify a Purple device that is fragmented. Mm-hmm. The certification is used also as a mean to enforce the standard.
Right.
There are means for customization. Anybody can use them, but what is common must remain common. It's not an easy task, but that's the ambition we have, okay? And this is what we are trying to achieve. We are not there yet, but this is definitely the ambition we have, because, all software engineers know that the APIs are not everything, okay? So this is one thing, it's important, but an operating system means much more. This is why we need to make sure that not only we have common APIs, but we really have a common platform that is really the same. The question is how to define the same, but that's the idea.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, this is, in my opinion, the beauty about the USP standard and the TR181 data model, because they both give you a unified view, a standardized view to the CPE, and a standardized way to communicate it. And this is perfect for certification and testing, because you have a standard. You have a standard that, let's say, tries to cover all about the CB. Thank you so much. Yeah. And yeah, Jason, you guys, you do great job here.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it really allows on the implementation side to say, okay, if something is not looking correct from the data model side and from the protocol side, then we have to fix it. Yeah. But if everything is okay, then you can put a, let's say, quality mark on it and say, okay, this is fulfilling the standard.
Mhm.
That's perfect.
All right. Any more audience questions? Matthew? Yeah, do it.
Important for standardizations and be used to speed all this thing. But this is, I mean, it's more a question that I think came from the room yesterday, perhaps. What about the, I mean, USB is an agent and controller. What about the open source controller in this case? I mean, because we often use the, I mean, yeah, but just why I'm not asking.
This is going to be another look a distracting question.
No, it's just because yeah, USB-A is also used to for some education for people who wants to explore the USB protocol,
right.
And they don't have any solution. Just I'm not asking for the all full package controller, but at least having an open source controller that could be used as education materials or for, I don't know, just having some tests, tries, and easy things. I know that there are some kind of very basic. We did work. We had this test controller on the project, but it was very limited and not so easy to use. So I'm wondering if it's something that could be a need identified perhaps by other people in the room, but having this open source controller. So.
Yeah, I mean, so part of the OBUSPA project is a OBUSPA test controller, as Mathieu was talking about. But agreed that is basically, it was a very quick and kind of, I would say, crude almost implementation of a test controller, because it's basically the same code as the agent with the ability to kind of flip its role around and send messages instead of get messages, because the agent can already handle what it gets and sets and adds, deletes all the USB messages. So it knows the language. The test controller, all it had to do is, instead of understanding the reading of it, it just had to understand the sending of it. So that was quick and easy. One of the things we've been talking about in the OBUSPA project is that as we've been evolving the code over the last 9 months or so to implement the USB services architecture, one of the concepts of the USB services architecture is we now have to embed a controller inside of that code to turn that agent into a broker. Such that it can talk to other services in the device. So the code now has a controller inside of it. So we're kind of trying to figure out at what point we could maybe kind of create some documentation or maybe some build options or something like that could actually basically turn the OBUSP agent into a controller instead of just, instead of a broker or an agent only, but have it be a controller only, so that you could then kind of start doing some testing. Yeah, I mean, it's not going to have a database of multiple agents and stuff like that, or a policy engine or anything that you would normally see in a kind of production quality controller, but it'd be something that you could, run up next to the OBUSP agent or any other agent if there are, and just test out things. So you would put it up against the device and test the device. Not testing like Cedar Router does.
Right.
Yeah, maybe a quick note on that. It might make sense. I mean, to me, it's like this. The OBUSPA implementation is also a reference implementation from the BBF. So if there's a reference implementation for a basic controller that shows implementers how to do it right, that makes sense to me. But let's say trying to build a little bit more capable controller, I think the requirements are so different, and there are companies that have decades of experience in how to build those systems. They only want to know how does the protocol work. The rest they know.
I'll also say that, the question, we constantly get questions about whether or not we are going to certify controllers. And from a testing perspective, it's just not realistic because, for one, there's not a lot of requirements on the controller other than the basic messages being correct, right? And two, it's from a test automation perspective, it's very difficult because we don't have a clear northbound API yet. It's close, but, so until those problems are solved, it's not going to be something that we can put into that wheelhouse very much. All right. Anything else? Great. Okay.
Wojciech from Coursera. So I have a question about OpenSync. Honestly speaking, I know very little about it. I know that it has something to do with open source, right? It's probably open source, and it serves some.
It's open source.
Yeah, and it serves some of the same use cases that I don't know, USP or Easy Mesh. Maybe you can give me some insights, if you know.
So let me provide my point of view. Okay, so yes, it's open source in the sense it has an open source license, okay, and it's available. Anybody can use it. The question is the way it works, okay, and what it means for the rest of your software platform. So from the Purple's perspective, as we defined this application layer, the way Purple is constructed is that this application layer, or what is under this application layer, makes sure that those applications will work, that there will be no problem between them. There will be, when they are controlling something, it goes through the same path. So there is a way to synchronize different requests for controlling something, and so on and so on. Now, if you look at the way OpenSync works, it goes very deeply. So the control you have as a kind of parallel control compared to what Purple does. I had a lot of discussions with them, and I said to them, guys, no, you need to put your stuff on top of the high-level APIs of the Purple Foundation just to have, a single point of control that is underlying. But this is not what they want. So basically, what it means is that either you have an application environment based on LCM and high-level APIs, or something based on OpenSync. You cannot have both.
For me, I will be very straightforward. So
Thank you,
first of all, OpenSync has an open in the name, but at the end, it's just a hook to pull you into the Plume ecosystem, frankly speaking. So what they are doing with OpenSync on every embedded OS, they are removing everything that makes this OS specific. They put their own stack on top, and then you need their management system to run your system. And this is the complete opposite, to me, from what we're trying to do here with USP. USP is an open standard. You can use an Xeros, ACS. You can use whatever you want. Yeah, it's open. It's really open, and it does not have open in the name, but it is.
Just one more thing. I had a very interesting discussion with one of the big American operators. I will not give the name. It's none of the three that are behind Purple. And they were asking a lot of questions about, they were using OpenSync and were wondering whether they need to move to Purple. And the main problem is because they had OpenSync in their CPEs, that they were unable to add any new service, even things extremely simple, like some speed tests, etc., without asking the provider or the platform to add it first. So they they were so dependent on the provider of the platform that they are just stuck right now.
Yeah, I mean, what they've said is it's very accurate and exactly true. And from my perspective, the open sync aspect of the open source aspect of it is the software that runs on the device is open source. The standard, there is none. There is no open standard that defines that. It's Plume specific communications into that software. Now, they will probably claim, well, we're based on open standards because they use OVSDB and MQTT. But just because you use a open standard protocol for communications doesn't mean it's an open standard, because you haven't defined what the messages you're going to send across and how they're formatted. And that's exactly what USP does. And that's why you can have any USB controller talking to any USB agent independent of what vendor created them.
And I mean, you can even boil it down. I mean, Ethernet is an open standard. Yes, yes, TCP. So, you know what?
Right.
So when anybody comes to me and says, well, they're using MQT, it's a standard. I'm like, if I write a program and you write a program and we're going to talk TCP together and we don't talk to each other about how we're going to send message across, do you think we're actually going to communicate?
Or if you don't talk to each other about what application you're even talking about. On the advice of my therapist, I'm not going to make any comments about OpenSync. All right. Cool. Thank you, everybody. This is awesome.